Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are joining us from April, those of you who are joining us new today. Thank you for coming to Tamaqua Museum's Lunch and Learn Revolution, Asserting Sovereignty series. So as the nation reflects on the American Revolution, we widen the lens to highlight Indigenous presence, leadership, and resistance, especially here in the Southern Dawnland, where Indigenous nations have lived and governed since long before the United States existed. Through this series, we gather to learn from Indigenous voices and reflect on sovereignty as an ongoing practice rooted in land and community. Our presenter today, Wunneanatsu Lamb-Cason, joins us to enlighten us on another related topic. But before we begin, a quick reminder to keep yourself on mute. You are welcome to share your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of today's presentation. Our free educational series is made possible through the generous support of the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, the United Way, Rhode Island Foundation, and community donors like you. And we are deeply grateful for your continued support, which allows us to share this educational programming with audiences near and far. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Wunneanatsu Lamb-Cason, who is Schaghticoke and Ho-Chunk, and she will share a presentation entitled Pedagogy as Power: How Indigenous Knowledge Systems Can Shape the Classroom. Wunneanatsu is an award-winning educator, advocate, storyteller, and author dedicated to social, cultural, and educational equity. The 2024 Gilda Lehrman National History Teacher of the Year, and she now serves as Assistant Director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Brown University, and she's owner of the Eastern Woodlands Education Consultants. She has developed Indigenous-centered educational materials for various institutions, including McGraw-Hill and the Library of Congress. And her best-selling children's book, Grandmother Moon, debuted in August of 2025. So be sure to get your copy. Thank you, Wunneanatsu, for joining us. We look forward to what you're sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Crystal, and thank you everyone for joining us here in this space. As Crystal said, my name is Wunneanatsu Lamb-Cason. I am Ho-Chunk and I am a enrolled citizen of the Schaghticoke Tribal Nation. And I am honored to be here today to talk to you about pedagogy as power. So to begin, I always like to start my workshops with a human check-in. If you are not familiar with this character, her name is Willie Jack, and she is from a show, Reservation Dogs. So I use these regularly in my classroom. I use them as check-ins, as a check for understanding of knowledge, or just to say, hey, on a scale of whoever the person is, how do you feel about that test? You know, which facial expression? But this is a great way to introduce Indigenous characters from movies, shows, music artists, actors, actresses, modern scientists and astronauts, politicians, to incorporate and start to introduce your students to Indigenous peoples outside and beyond the myths that we often see in our textbooks. So today the question is, on a scale of Willie Jack, how much have you considered the relationship between education and power? And if you are so inclined, want to just pop your number in the chat. Did my slide go away?
The slide is still there.
Okay, good. I was trying to move away so that I could see in the chat. Okay. Perfect. Well, I appreciate there's a wide array, and I appreciate everyone sharing. Wherever you're showing up today is enough, whether you've considered it a lot, whether you haven't. my hope is that this hour gives you something useful, something meaningful, and perhaps something to carry back into your own communities and classrooms. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the ideas that I'll share today are not mine alone. In many Indigenous communities, knowledge is understood as something carried and shared through relationships. We learn from those who came before us, from our families, from our communities, our lands and waters, and our elders. So I want to honor a few of my teachers whose guidance continues to shape how I understand education, community, and responsibility. Many of these pictures are of my grandmother, who was a Schaghticoke educator, historian, storyteller, and one of the people who taught me that preserving knowledge is an act of sovereignty. And I was honored to have so many wonderful Indigenous educators and elders, teachers throughout my lifetime, even if it's just observing in community. Tall Oak Whedon was an absolute icon in my life. Watching Ramona Peters from Mashpee Wampanoag, I was always so captivated by her and just observing her and how she engaged in community and with the land and at powwows. Dawn Dove and Barry Kavash and just all of these amazing educators. Many of us were taught to begin presentations by listing degrees and credentials. And Indigenous knowledge systems often invite us to begin somewhere different, by recognizing the relationships that made our learning possible. So everything that I learned today, I was shaped by these relationships. So I'd like you to think about one of the most important things you've ever learned. Not necessarily something you learned in school, something that shaped how you move through the world. Who taught it to you? Where did that learning happen? For many of us, the answers aren't a classroom, a textbook, or an exam. They might be a grandparent's kitchen, a community gathering, a fishing spot, a church, a garden, a walk in the woods. The location matters because Indigenous knowledge systems remind us that learning is always situated. It happens somewhere, it happens with someone, and it happens within relationships. What's interesting is that very few people's answers when I pose these questions before are a textbook or a classroom lesson. Yet many of our school systems often operate as though those are the primary places where meaningful learning occurs. And Indigenous pedagogies challenge that assumption. Today's session begins with a simple premise that education is never neutral. Every educational system reflects values of that community. Every curriculum privileges certain knowledge. Every classroom communicates whose knowledge matters and whose stories are worth telling and what ways of knowing are considered legitimate. For Indigenous people, let's see, there we go. Education has always or has often been used as a tool of assimilation and erasure. Education has been one of the primary tools used to disrupt Indigenous languages, governance systems, cultural practices, and relationships to community and place. But education can also be a powerful tool or a powerful expression, of sovereignty. Education has become one of the most powerful tools for cultural revitalization, language reclamation, and nation building. That tension between what it can or cannot do, or where the conflict is really why Indigenous pedagogy matters. And that's the lens that I would like for us to explore today. So colonial education structures, they knew the power of education. And we know that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on the Indian boarding schools because, as my grandmother would say, that is a conversation for another day. But I do want to point out that education was used as a tool of colonization, either to control, restrict, or assimilate. These two images, and I on the side, I hope that you can see my pointer, are from the Fox, I think it's the Fox, I'm sorry, Forest Grove Industrial Training School in Oregon. Students from the early 1800s. These two photos on top of each other are an example of propaganda before and after images that schools would often produce to show what they're accomplishing in assimilating our children. And so, one of the impacts you can see that when this photo is a courtesy of the Oregon Historical Society, but it was noted that between these two photos being taken, that one of the children in the earlier photo had died before the second photo was even taken 7 months later. So the goal with these school systems was not simply to change what Indigenous children knew, but how they knew it, to shift that power dynamic. When we talk about assimilation, we often focus on the loss of language or cultural practices, but colonial education systems also attempted to replace Indigenous ways of learning. Learning through story became learning through notebooks or textbooks. Learning through observation became learning through instruction. Learning through relationships became learning through institutions. Learning rooted in place became learning detached from place. And so, in many ways, colonial schooling sought to redefine what counted as knowledge itself. I also want to challenge a common assumption. Sometimes when we discuss colonial education, people assume that Indigenous communities were opposed to schooling or formal education, and that's not always the case. In the mid 1700s, leaders from my own tribe, from Schaghticoke, approached the town of Kent in what is now Western Connecticut and requested that a school be built on the reservation for our children. The town refused, and their response was that Indian children were essentially feral, and incapable of being educated properly. So rather than accepting that decision, Schaghticoke leaders sought another path. They invited Moravian missionaries to the reservation to build a school and mission, because they understood that the missionaries would provide instruction, particularly in literacy. And so, why was this important? Because our leaders recognized that our children needed to understand colonial ways of knowing, especially colonial languages, in order to survive and navigate the rapidly changing world around them. And so, what I find powerful about this story is that it reminds us that Indigenous communities have never been anti-education. The question has always been education for what purpose? In service of whose goals? Under whose control? And so, those questions remain relevant today, right? Indigenous communities have long understood education as essential. The tension has been whether education would be used to assimilate Indigenous peoples into someone else's vision of society, or whether it could support Indigenous self-determination and community continuance. So, before we talk about what Indigenous pedagogy is, let's talk about what it isn't. Indigenous pedagogy is not simply adding Native content to an existing curriculum. It's not celebrating Native American heritage. Oops, I went too far. It's not celebrating Native American Heritage Month. It's not a list of activities, protocols, or teaching tricks. And it's certainly not a single approach shared by every Indigenous nation. Just as Indigenous peoples are diverse, Indigenous pedagogies are diverse. And for the sake of this discussion, I apologize for using generalizations, but it is a very important point to make that each one thing that worked for one nation may not have been the choice of another. There is a lot of diversity amongst Indigenous peoples. So to continue, many Indigenous knowledge systems share common understandings, right, about relationships, about learning, about responsibility. So, as I said, there is not one universal approach. Instead of traditional standardized Western education, Indigenous pedagogy emphasizes experiential, holistic, and land-based learning. This is knowledge passed down through oral traditions, through storytelling and intergenerational sharing, fostering community responsibility and an innate respect for the environment. One way to understand the difference is to think about the questions being asked. Many contemporary education systems focus on the acquisition of knowledge. What do students know? Can they demonstrate it? Can they perform it on an assessment? Indigenous pedagogies often begin somewhere else. How are we relating to one another? How are we relating to the land? What responsibilities emerge from what we've what responsibilities emerge from what we've learned? In many Indigenous knowledge systems, learning is not complete when information is acquired. Learning is complete when responsibility is enacted. So when I think about Indigenous pedagogies across many nations, four themes consistently emerge for me. Relationship. This is knowledge does not exist independently from people, from communities, from lands and waters, plants and animals, from ancestors. We learn through relationships, and knowledge is not simply possessed, it is carried. Responsibility. This is perhaps the biggest shift for many educators. In dominant educational models, knowledge often becomes a personal achievement. I know something. I earned a grade. I gained expertise. In Indigenous pedagogies, learning often creates responsibility. Once I know something, what am I obligated to do with that knowledge? Am I responsible for using this knowledge to care for the community? Responsible for ensuring it is passed on appropriately? Responsibility to the person who gifted me this knowledge? Reciprocity. Knowledge is not merely extracted, right? There needs to be a return of that. So we often operate in educational systems that reward collecting of knowledge and having access to knowledge just because it exists. And so Indigenous pedagogies ask, what are you giving back? How does learning strengthen relationships rather than simply benefiting an individual? And then last is place. Learning happens somewhere. And I said this earlier, the land and waters, the environment is not simply a backdrop for education. The land itself and the waters itself is teacher. Like it is a teacher. It is an archive. It is a relative. It is a source of knowledge. So in the classroom, this looks like studying local histories and landscapes. Indigenous pedagogies are less concerned with information transfer and more concerned with cultivating good relationships with knowledge, with community, and with our non-human relatives. This model comes from Canadian researcher and scholar Teresa Papp's study that focuses on Indigenous pedagogy and as a holistic approach to better support Indigenous students, learning outcomes, and graduation success. Through this model, you can see, it's transformative if this is applied to contemporary school systems. It is used for decolonizing education for Indigenous students, right? And we can see how Papp's research focuses on holistic viewpoints and the importance of culture, always student-centered and always enveloped in culture. It's important to learn to focus on the interconnectedness of these aspects for a whole and healthy person and student. The concept through an Indigenous lens is seen as we are all connected as humans, connected to place, and connected to all other life around us. And that helps us understand the complexities of Indigenous pedagogy and how it is intertwined and cultural knowledge and with cultural knowledge and worldview. One challenge when discussing Indigenous pedagogies is that people immediately want a list of classroom strategies, and that's understandable. I was a classroom teacher for over a decade, and educators are practical people and already have so much on their plates. But Indigenous pedagogies are bigger than any individual strategy. So they shape how we understand knowledge itself. So rather than asking, what activity can I do tomorrow? I want us to think about some of the practices that emerge from Indigenous ways of knowing. In many educational settings, stories are viewed as a way to make learning engaging. In Indigenous communities, stories are often the curriculum. They carry historical knowledge, the environmental knowledge, cultural values, community memory, and ethical teachings. The purpose of a story is not always to provide an answer. Sometimes its purpose is to help us reflect on our responsibilities. My grandmother, as I said, was a teacher. She began her teaching career as a kindergarten and first grade teacher in New York City. She was also a renowned master storyteller, and it seemed natural for her to use storytelling in her teaching practice. And as her eldest grandchild, every moment throughout my childhood was a teachable moment that often led to a story and a lesson. The walk to the outhouse became plant and medicine identification or listening to bird calls. And oh, that reminds me of a story about how birds got their songs. A trek in the snow. Oh, look, Wunneanatsu, what animal do you think made that print? Oh, you're right, that's rabbit. Let me tell you a story about rabbit and why his ears are so long. Each story held a lesson, a teaching, ecological knowledge, history, whether that is family or tribal or more broad. My grandmother often reminded me that stories are not simply about the past, they are instructions for how to live. The One of the most significant differences in Indigenous pedagogies is the understanding that learning happens in relationship with place. The land is not a backdrop. It is a wealth of knowledge. It is a wonderful source of knowledge. And this is related, in place-based learning. We hear that a lot now in educational forums. And this includes local histories, studying watersheds, looking at Indigenous homelands and stewardship, and ecological relationships. For Indigenous people, rivers, forests, mountains, coastlines, and seasonal cycles contain generations of accumulated understanding. And as a former geography teacher, this idea has always resonated with me. We can learn history from a place. We can learn ecology from a place. We can learn about relationships and responsibility from a place. So, one of the questions I often ask teachers is not just what happened here, but whose homeland is this? And what stories does this landscape hold? Many Indigenous pedagogies emphasize learning through observation and participation. The way that our brains are taught to process knowledge, that 0 to 5 nurture culture of when we are learning about the world around us really influences our students' learning style and how they process knowledge in the classroom. And for many Indigenous students, they are experiential learners because of that introduction to knowledge. So rather than the way that this works is rather than being told every step, learners are often invited to watch, to practice, to make mistakes, to reflect, think about it. How did this go wrong? What can we do better next time? And then try again. This approach develops independence, attentiveness, and responsibility. It recognizes that not all knowledge can be transmitted through direct instruction. You can't necessarily learn how to do everything through reading about it. That's why we have practicums. That's why we have residencies, right, in Western academia, because that framework is understood. So the way that this would look in, say, within Indigenous pedagogy would be like learning to harvest, learning ceremonial responsibilities, learning craft traditions, learning community protocols. These are all things that must be observed and cannot necessarily be learned through what in educational world would call traditional instruction. Many schools separate learners by age, and Indigenous communities have often learned across generations. Intergenerational learning is something that is very important within Indigenous pedagogies. Children learn from elders, elders learn from the youth. Knowledge is carried collectively. And this challenges the idea that expertise resides only in institutions or credentials. The most important things I've learned about education didn't come from my graduate program. They came from elders, from community members, and from my experiences through relationship. Learning as responsibility. This may be the most important principle of all. In many educational settings, learning ends when understanding is demonstrated. Like once you've passed the geography state standardized test, you don't have to take geography again. You don't have to be questioned on whether you can identify how many countries in the continent of Africa are. So, a test is passed, a paper is submitted, a grade is assigned. In Indigenous pedagogies, learning creates responsibility. It's not what did you learn, but what will you do with what you've learned? Knowledge is not just something that you possess. It is something that you are accountable to. Thinking within the framework of like the next 7 generations, learning should consider impact beyond immediate outcomes. So questioning who benefits, who is affected, what futures are we creating? This can be connected in so many content areas across the educational landscape, through climate, through civic education, through historical inquiry. These are all things that we can be responsible to and are responsible not only to this generation, but 7 generations in the future. Throughout this session, I've used the phrase pedagogy as power. Power is often associated with wealth, politics, laws, governments, but power also exists in classrooms. It exists in the stories as well. It exists in the questions we ask. It exists in whose knowledge is treated as legitimate, and it exists in ways we teach. Pedagogy shapes how people understand themselves, their communities, and their responsibilities to others. When people hear the word sovereignty, they often think only about political authority. But Indigenous nations have always understood sovereignty more broadly. Sovereignty lives in language, it lives in stories, it lives in cultural practices, and it lives in how knowledge is passed down from one generation to the next. Every time a community teaches its children who they are, where they come from, and what responsibilities they carry, self-determination and sovereignty is being practiced. And education, in that way, education is sovereignty in practice by allowing, like what Schaghticoke leaders did in 1743 was, okay, they're not going to help us. We want to make sure that our children are educated in the English language so that they can navigate these things. One of our leaders also sent his son to New Haven to be educated in the law so that he could come back and help the tribe navigate some of the questionable uh, deeds that were signed and some of the laws and challenges that the tribe was facing in their relationship with the colony of Connecticut. Education is one of the most powerful expressions of sovereignty. Indigenous pedagogies remind us that education is never simply about transferring information. It's about sustaining relationships. It's about carrying knowledge responsibly. It's about ensuring that future generations inherit not only facts, but ways of understanding their place in the world. And ultimately, that is why pedagogy matters, because pedagogy holds power. Um, I will stop a few minutes early and open for questions.
Now, let's see what we have here in our chat. As a former ethnic studies teacher in Massachusetts, what was being taught in 8th grade civics curriculum, ethnic studies, was not more than Euro-American heteropatriarchy and hegemony, with a nod at students' cultural backgrounds, placing Tainos as more in the past than present. She says, I taught in the majority Puerto Rican district. Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't a question. She was making a statement and saying thank you.
No, yeah, I agree that that's a challenge. But it would be hold on, I want to make sure that I'm understanding the Euro.
Mm-hmm.
I think I misinterpreted the comment was being taught.
I can clarify if that helps.
Oh, yes, that would help.
I
Thank
just
you.
want to say that even though it was an ethnic studies department or a district-wide program in seventh and eighth grade, which was required for all seventh and eighth graders, the district's administration was constantly just undermining any real centered and like community-centered knowledge transmission. And the way in which Tainos were presented in this majority Puerto Rican school district was often very much like a relic of the past. And yes, there are movements towards like language reclamation, and some people are of Taino ancestry, but no like real recognition and like what you said, what do you do? Like, what is the outcome of learning? It's about acknowledging responsibilities, then pursuing it. That was not like the directive or the sense of the sense of kind of where we should put our energy and power.
Mm. And yeah, and that's something that we see across the country, in communities that are majority Puerto Rican and communities that are not. I taught African American history in Spotsylvania, Virginia, which is a place that is very proud of its Confederate roots. And if you have seen Roots, the film series, Spotsylvania is the county where Kunta Kinte was enslaved. And the family whose history it is based on, up until a few years ago, still owned the same property. And so while I was teaching, and teaching African American history while driving to school, and driving past Confederate iconography, um, is uh, is very conflicting. But that's why, I know that a lot of counties do push back. And what I encourage teachers to do in those instances is to always stick to the curriculum, because that makes it more challenging for them to push back, if you are just following along with the curriculum. However, there are entry points, and sometimes you have to be a little creative. Um, I like to do a lot of compare and contrast. So if I have to teach about this, how can I compare Indigenous content in the same area? So I'm still teaching the curriculum, but I'm comparing this. In Virginia, the state standards for geography and cultures is broken down into units, and within those locale units, they are thematically broken down, between cultural geography, physical geography, and political geography. And in the U.S. and Canada unit, Native American and under cultural geography, Native American and Indigenous people are not mentioned at all. And the only time in the entire course that Indigenous people are mentioned is in the Latin America unit, where they only discuss Incans, Mayans, and Aztecs in a historical context, and in the Oceania unit, where they mention Maori people when discussing New Zealand. And so what I did was I introduced Indigenous people in my US and Canada unit through comparison. Like, okay, this is what the colonists were doing at the time and how they were interacting with the landscape. How do you think they learned that? Let's compare what the Indigenous experience was at the same time. And so that was my entry point. I was still sticking to the curriculum, but I was incorporating Indigenous peoples as much as I could.
Thank you. A couple of questions to come into the chat. So if educators wanted to begin including American Indian legislation, policies, politics into civics studies in K through 12 education, how do you think that can begin? Where should it start? How can educators get information to begin working toward that goal?
Okay. So this is I think, a twofold answer. On one end, it needs to happen legislatively with curriculum at the state and federal levels, because teachers need the supports in order to teach it effectively in their classroom. Because we know that Indigenous studies, that Indigenous sovereignty governance is not taught in teacher prep programs, and so teachers do not feel equipped to teach about it, and so then quite often it's left out. I think that depending on, obviously, grade level appropriate, and I think the place to start is through vocabulary, teaching what is sovereignty, what is a tribal nation, defining for them, introducing to your students, and that's something that can be done at all levels, right? K through 12. And applying those terms and learning those terms, learn what a reservation is, so starting with vocabulary. And that's just a basic educational strategy, right? When we're introducing any new content area. And then, so that's from the classroom perspective. I do believe, when from the higher end, from the other end of curriculum writing and legislative decisions, I do think that we need to be informed citizens, that we need to be engaged citizens, whether that is at the local, state, or federal level. And so reach out to, if you know, I keep an eye on my state's standard cycle. So when standards are up for reevaluation, I reach out to the state board, ask to be part of the conversation, offer resources, ask to who can we talk to, who's representing Indigenous people. Usually there, and depends on the state, it varies. Usually there is a public comment when standards are being revisited. Be in contact with your representatives so that if they're being a part of the conversation, so that can enact change on one end. It really worked well in Connecticut that just recently passed new Indigenous education mandates, K through 12. And that was a grassroots effort of where that started. And so that can happen from that end. But we don't, and we all know, if you are a classroom educator, you know that you don't need permission from your district, from your state, your standards, your written mandated curriculum to teach something or to introduce a teaching style, a teaching strategy, a lesson plan in your classroom. So you can start with talking about, some of the just strategies, Indigenous pedagogies of reciprocity, and modeling that for your students, modeling intergenerational learning. Like, oh, I'm going to teach you about this, and I want you to teach me about this, and sharing in that way. Talking about community in your classroom, and bringing in the land and waters, and our non-human relatives into the equation, into the conversation. For the last part was where can they get information working towards that goal? That's a struggle because so American Indian, it's NIEA, it's the National Indian Education Association. They are a great resource for Indian education. There are several books out there on decolonizing education, depending on what your content area is. Dr. Leilani Sabsalian at University of Oregon has 2 books out on decolonizing Indigenous education. There's like Sandy Grandy's Red Pedagogy, if you want to look at political thought and the impact on education. There's several out there. What I always recommend whenever you are looking for Indigenous literature to bring into your classroom, whether you are looking for a educational instructional book, always vet through sources that are reliable. NMAI, Tamaquag, vet through them to see if they have recommendations for books. Look at the author. Are they an enrolled citizen of their tribe? If they are speaking on behalf, if they are claiming indigeneity, make sure that they are transparent about their identity, and that they, because that, in a way, holds them accountable to the community that they're speaking for. And then, yeah, there's several sources, museums, NMAI, Tamaquag, Mashantucket, and there's several Indigenous educators who are putting work out. California, the state department in California, California Indian Education, is doing some wonderful things. The Indian Community School in Minneapolis is, I believe, the country's only intertribal charter school. They have like 400 students of tribes all over, um, and it's a K through 8 school. It is informed through Indigenous ways of knowing and pedagogy, from the building structure to the names of the rooms. And so it is a wonderful example of Indigenous pedagogy in practice. They have a Facebook page, they have an Instagram, so you can see some of the program that they're doing, the lessons that they're doing. So that is another really great example.
Thank you for that information as well. So there is so much to learn here. I love the focus on relationships and the responsibility to use the learning to better the place you are in. All teachers would benefit from this focus. The central question of what will you do with the learning that has been shared with you is critical today. Uh,
Mm.
Question: any special considerations for educators teaching in urban environments where students lack equitable access to natural environments, off-site opportunities? I'm thinking about how to incorporate place and natural relationships in these specific settings where access might be limited.
Mm-mm. In in those instances, when offsite opportunities are are restrictive, there's ways to bring the waters and the lands into the classroom. There, uh, even if it's on a small scale, YouTube, I know that watching a video of something is nowhere near the same as, putting your feet in the grass of a place. But when we are limited there,
Mhm.
I would also do um, like teaching them about that place. How did it become an urban place, right? Because it wasn't always that. Providence was once a amazing gathering place of all of the tribes in the region, like almost like a trade hub, it was a political seat. It was, so the history of just Providence and how Providence became what it is today is a way to bring in the land and learning about it, and the just looking at the landscape itself, the hills and what we know that College Hill, where Brown sits, was a very important place for Narragansett people. And you can talk about that. So the hill is still there, the land is still there, just the shapes on top of the land have changed.
Mm, thank you. And you mentioned in your presentation about the curriculums that you've helped um, educators to develop. Are they something that is available online that anyone can access, or are there certain permissions, like are they owned by those communities that you've helped, or are they so that teachers can access them freely or other
So
educators?
that varies on the project. So what I did for McGraw-Hill was textbook. So that's closer. That's going to be a fourth. It's coming out next year. It's going to be a fourth grade classroom
Oh.
textbook. Um, there's the lesson plans that I did for Library of Congress. Those are available. That I mean that the ones is available. It's the primary sources teacher's guide, and they used to produce that every other year, I believe. Um, but they're yeah, so and then if I wrote something like for a community, then it stays with that community.
Hmm. Thank you. I always ask, we have so many educators who will contact us as at Tamaquag and asking for resources. So I like to note where to
Oh,
send
yeah.
them to access these kind of resources. So thank you. There is a link someone provided in another resource for educators comes from the Mohegan Tribe in Connecticut. There's a link provided in the chat for that.
Oh, yes.
So, okay.
The
Silver Moon included the
Mohegan,
link that you mentioned.
Yeah, Mohegan has a really great education department. Mashantucket is working on their tribal has Mashantucket on their um, tribal Department of Education page. Um, they do have several lesson plans on there. They have one for like Treaty of
Mhm.
Hartford and things like that. So what I recommend is reaching out to reaching out to your local tribe wherever you live, and seeing if if their government has an education website or an education department, and reaching out and seeing what resources they have, because again, then that is allowing you to be in place and teaching about the peoples of that land, before reaching out to, say, if you live in Rhode Island, and reaching out to South Dakota and asking Pine Ridge if they have lesson plans on Indigenous peoples, when you could very easily work with Tamaquag.
Thank you. It looks like we're nearing the end of our time. There's another note in the chat, pequateducation.com. Thank you, Tamaquag Tech, for being so quick with these links. We just have a couple more minutes before we close. If there's any last minute questions, if anyone wants to quickly unmute and ask their question of Wunneanatsu before we close our session for today. I know if you're like me, you can't type quick enough to get something in the chat. Okay, well, hearing none, I just want to say thank you so much, Wunny, for joining us today. Thank you for this amazing presentation. And as a fellow educator, it was very enlightening and helpful. Thank you everyone else for joining us in our presentation today as well. This presentation will be available on YouTube page later this month, so you can rewatch it, review it, take your time and take more notes if you'd like. And please do tell others about it, so that they too can watch it and gain this information. We encourage you also to join us next month as we continue our Lunch and Learn series, Revolution Asserting Sovereignty. I look forward to the next speaker. As we carry this conversation together, you can check our website and register for that if you're not already registered for all of them. Also visit Tamaquag's website for any additional upcoming events. We do have our honoring event in July. I believe that's the next, but there may be other things. There's a children's hour that begins this week for those of you who have young family members. And we wish you all a lovely afternoon, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.